Hello, and welcome to this edition of Secure Networks, the Endace Packet Forensic Files, with your host, Michael Morris. This week's very special guest is Timothy Wilson-Johnston, Value Chain Security Leader at Cisco. Timothy, welcome. Thanks for joining. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Hey, thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me on. As you said, my name is Timothy Wilson-Johnston. I lead Value Chain Security for Cisco, and I sit within the Security and Trust organization. Our role is to help drive security and governance back into all our products and offers, and to make sure as we think about our third party and our supply chain risk management processes that we're accounting for threat actor capabilities and evolving tradecraft that's happening in that space. Prior to joining Cisco, I was 20 years in the US government, doing a variety of things from cybersecurity operations to counterterrorism operations. So I'm glad to be on the show with you.
Well, I really appreciate you taking time and excited to hear your expertise as advanced persistent threat expert. I know you are, especially. I want to talk about a recent big attack, right? The Log4j2. Why don't you share the details of the CVE and why it's so serious of a threat?
Yeah, great question. I mean, when we think about Log4j and its prolific nature across a lot of the industry, it was embedded in many processes using Java.
Right.
And because of that dependency and the fact that this was a open source software that was made for a very specific function, a lot of the security wasn't necessarily thought about how to implement that and make sure it was thought through properly. And it's not to say that there's something inherently wrong with open source software or security implications of that, but it's really on us as the consumers of that to really understand the functionality and make sure we're bringing the right security into that. And it had a high CVE score of 10. And so we need to be thinking about those things as we integrate open source software into any of our applications and making sure we understand the vulnerabilities baked in there, be able to have good tracking of that and be able to remediate when problems are found.
No, it's that's the breadth of it was what was astonishing to me on this one. And obviously we know so many apps are written in Java, so that's not surprising. Obviously, everyone's first priority is patching any systems they may have running it. But then what should they do? As I understand it, there have already been tons of botnets scanning the internet for compromised systems. And in that window of the first announcement, there's likely many other malware instances that were installed in the scanning process. But right. So what should people have been doing right around the patching, right? Or right after the patching?
Well, I think most importantly, and this is something that the US government did really well when you look at CISA and how they came out and really heightened the attention around this and gave a sense of urgency. And so as a consumer of these types of software or users of these type of software, you need to be looking in the right place to identify the importance of this and understand the severity and being able to decide when to react. When we look at a CVE score of 10, we'll see that a lot with a lot of different CVEs out there. But it's really about, is there proof of concept code already out there running? And we know this can be exploited. Are we seeing it exploited in the wild? And do you have the right threat intel to understand who's doing it and who's targeting you with that? And so once you kind of understand that, then you need to figure out, well, how do I detect that in my own environment? And that's about having good software supply chain inventory. But then how do you prioritize what you remediate? So you might obviously focus on internet facing first, and then look at internal facing uses of that. And so for a company like Cisco, we might have areas where all of our offers to our customers, anything internet facing, that's going to be our first priority. But if we're looking at like our lab environments or we're looking at other environments, that might be a secondary priority to go shore up. So you have to do some triage on how you deal with these vulnerabilities.
Okay.
The other important thing to highlight is the focus of this one was on version 2. But yet there was an RCE for version 1. Almost 10 years ago, and no one was talking about that. And so as you think about adversaries starting to look at a current version, you have to also think retrospectively, because if they have already had a proof of remote code exploitation, they could go back and you go after that older version.
Okay. No, that's tremendous insight. And in fact, I had that discussion with our teams on a blog I had written about it, log4j2, right? So the
Right.
versioning did matter there.
Yes, it did
So,
matter. Yeah.
so what are some other examples of threats or malware that you've heard or seen as a result of the initial vulnerability?
Well, so as we all heard, a lot of this is being exploited by nation state adversaries, and they're trying to take
Right.
advantage of this vulnerability. And whenever a vulnerability has come out as a hyper focus, and they know patching is happening, adversaries are going to go try to
Mhm.
go after that vulnerability immediately and make as much hay as they can. And so thinking about that, and then thinking about the global context of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine right now, and we know Russia has targeted Ukraine before
Mhm.
as part of their cyber operations, their policies, holding Ukraine at risk, holding the rest of the world at risk for doing business with Ukraine. We have to be concerned with spillover of any cyber activity that could happen in Ukraine that affects the rest of the world. Because looking back at, for example, NotPetya, a clear targeting by Russia of Ukraine's tax service, but had global implications because of everyone who did business with Ukraine. And when we think about the current context, we have to think
Yeah.
about that. It's not an isolated cyber war in a lot of these aspects. And
Right.
so that's the thing that worries me the most. And so there's a lot of advice out there right now by DHS CISA about shields up. And so obviously US government and is recommending that for US. And I think other government agencies are going to recommend the same thing, that they need to go shore up and know that there's a chance of cyber spillover from this war that's happening right now.
Okay. No, tremendous insight there. Taking a step back from this threat, what does this type of threat in such a common component mean for software or hardware vendors and their SBOM, right? Their software bill of materials.
Yeah, this is again about good inventory and good accountability of what is in your development environment, what's in your operational environment, and having a way to catalog that and immediately identify that. So in Cisco, we have a process whenever we bring in third-party software
Mm.
that we run it through an evaluation process, one, to know what's in it, but two, to have an inventory of it. So if a vulnerability is identified in the future, we immediately know where we've used that software, whether it's in an offer or a product that's going to a customer, or whether it's in support of Cisco operations or run the business sense. And so that's really important, is to have that good inventory and good accountability to immediately go find where you have that in your environment. The other important thing is making sure you have good versioning control, because again, as we talked about, version 2 was the main problem, but if you had version 1, you should also be having a program or process to remediate that also. And so you need to know where that version is throughout your whole environment.
No, that's the important piece. And versioning is such a hard problem, right? Because you have so many components in your applications, in your hardware solutions, and maintaining those version controls and the updates there can be a real challenge, right? Especially with some of
Exactly.
the legacy systems out there.
That's right.
I expect there'll be many more of these types of vulnerabilities in the years ahead because of the amount of open source code and code reuse, right? Are there
Yep.
safeguards or ways to prevent this?
I mean, prevention is obviously the ultimate goal, but
Right.
again, as we talked about, good inventory and detection is the primary goal. So you need to have a way to understand what's in your environment and how to detect that immediately. So that's about having good application visibility,
Mm.
about having good network flow visibility. So
Mhm.
if a vulnerability is discovered in a host, do you have the right? You may not have the right ability to detect it on the host, but do you have it ability to detect it in your network sensors as it tries to beacon out to different infrastructure? Having that third-party software risk management process, as we talked
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
early on, is how do I inventory what's coming in, do an assessment of that, and track that in a repeatable process. And really making sure that you have good software maintenance status. You know where your software is, what version you're at. Have you gotten to the latest version? A lot of times we'll know what software we have in our environment, but not the version. So you have to have that good inventory.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to have a plan once you detect it on how you're going to isolate it and remediate it. And so that's about having, again, good endpoint visibility, good net flow to understand where something could be beaconing out, good DNS security and understanding if it's touching malicious domains, and being able to immediately isolate and remediate wherever that instance might be in your environment.
Okay. No, it's important, the software maintenance thing. This is definitely making a case for keeping current on all your maintenance
Exactly.
agreements and things like that. So speaking on the vendor side, how do vendors need to adjust or rethink their approaches in the development process? Are they going to have to bring everything in-house and stop using code reuse? And you and I were talking in the kind of the pre-discussions and planning of this of even repositories like GitHub are out there for organizations, right?
Yeah.
So how do things like that play into the vendor side and development?
Yeah, a great question. And it really does come down to having a known good environment for your engineers and developers to point to. And so you do that first evaluation to bring in things from the external internet, open source libraries, and bring them in through a process that they can be evaluated. You can do the vulnerability scanning of, you can understand how to build the bill of materials, and then be able to point to known good binaries, known good source code. So you're always pulling from the right repository, and you're not just allowing your developers or engineers just to pull something off the internet. And so you've got to establish that that alignment, that program, and that really pointing to a good registry for them to go to. So one of the things we're doing is developing our own internal Git, so we can make sure that's where known good is and point our developers there.
Okay. No, that's an important piece. It's just the amount of code sharing and platforms out there to even share applications that to interconnect, connectors of applications and things like that. So it becomes a very snowballing complex problem for IT administrators, I'm sure. So
Exactly.
So looking forward, ask all of our guests to kind of be a prognosticator of key things to look out for. What's one thing you'd recommend to our listeners to really, pay attention to or think about over the next 6 to 18 months in the ever-shifting battle for cybersecurity?
Yeah. I mean, I think we see when we look at what's happening with the executive orders, we look at supply chain risk management as a whole. It's about understanding your third-party ecosystem and understanding the security that you've implemented or aligned them to, because you're creating these transitive trust relationships when you work with these different third parties, and you're bringing them into your environment, and you need to understand the security implications and make sure you've bought down that risk. And so if you don't have a good understanding of why they're in your environment, a good understanding of the transitive trust relationships you've established with them, what type of IP do they have, what services are they bringing to you, then you really don't know the risk you're buying down. And so that would be the thing I would encourage. And it's a growing concern among a lot of our customers, is how are we managing the third-party risk of our vendors, our suppliers, our subcontractors. And so that's about having the right curriculum and responsibilities that you drive into those ecosystems, where you can monitor them and hold them accountable to your program of good supply chain risk management. At Cisco, we do this in a variety of ways. One, with our different manufacturers, we have ways of auditing them and holding them accountable to our master security specification that has 200 controls in it across 11 different domains. We do that through our contract language and making sure that they are meeting our agreements and how we do secure development lifecycle. We do that in a third-party risk assessment with outside vendors to assess that continually assess those subcontractors for third-party risks. So there's a variety of ways you can do that, but that to me is the key moving forward, is good third-party risk management.
No, great insights, Timothy. I really appreciate always talking to you. I always learn a variety of things in our conversations. Thanks for joining and sharing your insights and how to better secure networks. We'd ask our listeners to tune in next time for another edition of the Endace Packet Forensic Files. For more information about Endace's network packet capture platform and our integrations with our fusion technology partners like Cisco, please go to endace.com. Timothy, thanks again for taking the time and sharing your insights.
Great catching up, Michael. Talk to you soon.